Monsieur le Ministre.
Minister, good evening. You said in 2011 that you shouldn't exclude bankruptcy of a European state, and Italy saw its rating in Standards and Poor's reduced to B-, and as such that was less than junk bonds. If you have a debt to GDP ratio of 132%, then you're actually in a worse situation than France for debt and unemployment. So what solution do you suggest? Let's look at recent activities. You seemed to be suggesting massive privatization. In Italy, you announced a vast program of takeovers, 40% of the railways in your country, but also in the post system and air control systems, and then as well Eni and Enel, your national strategic industries in the energy sector, and then relaunching investments and demand. Is that what's done? No, just to get rid of the public debt that was accumulated through years of speculation and waste. Now, what should countries do when faced with indebtedness? Well, it would seem that in France, too, we have had problems in this area. Then there's a second point, too, the question of federalism in Europe and handing over to the Commission the task of defining the necessary structural changes and reforms. In other words, after banking secrecy, now the European countries will see their labour law or retirement law decided in Brussels. 68 years in France, that's likely to become a reality in the future. Can you tell us when and how the European Union should institute such reforms? I think the nation is the key, and public debt will be solved not so much through structural reforms, but more by looking at the role of the ECB, and in particular with the future launching that it will be doing of the Curie. And I think that sovereign states need to take control of their monetary policy and have national currencies again. The member states have to be able to finance themselves from their national banks and have to be able to use the open market and that's the way to avoid bankruptcy or virtual bankruptcy amongst themselves, countries such as Greece. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure I understood the questions, but let me try to answer anyways. You mentioned how is Italy dealing with the debt problem, which is a problem. I just recognize that. Well, it's mainly dealing to the way which I find to be the master way to get rid of debt. And the master way to get rid of debt is to grow. So the issue that Italy is facing is to restore growth which has been declining, as I mentioned already more than once, for 2 decades. And this is what the structural reform programme is about, restoring growth opportunities and therefore job opportunities. And I think we're making progress in that direction. So with more growth, which is largely dependent but not fully dependent upon structural measures implemented by the government, we'll get more growth. If we could get more nominal growth through more inflation, which is beyond the control, of course, of national countries, then we would have aggregate growth which, given current interest rates and given the ongoing fiscal effort, with the primary surplus always being in the positive for decades, in my country, this would put debt in Italy on a downward path without any other problems. On top of that, we have an ambitious privatization programme which has 2 aims. One is to contribute to the elimination of debt. Any receipts would of course go to cutting the debt, but also to increase competitiveness pressures and management pressures on the management of the companies you mentioned, which will remain under public control. Only they will be more exposed to management practices which are typical of the private sector and which lead to efficiency. On the second point which you mentioned, the role of sovereign states versus the role of European institutions, and you mentioned monetary policy, you mentioned reforms and so forth, well, I do not take that as a question. I take that as a statement, and I leave it to you. I certainly do not disclose any secret by mentioning that I would not agree with what your statement implies. So although there is of course the need of collaboration between national governments and European institutions, you need both. Thank you.
Thank you. We are running